Hang on. Rachel and I are learning all about owning our own Zoom, which is a new thing for us. So hang on one second here. Where is Rachel? Where is she? I know you're right there, but like, where are you when you here? She's like, do you want help? I'm like, yes. Hang on, I think I got you. More. I know I'm right here. There you go. Bam. Perfect. Okay, cool. So actually, I'm stalling. She's gonna hit record. I'm stalling. All right, cool. Hey, thanks everyone for coming today. It feels a lot longer than a month since we last chatted. So you are at the Aftercamp Meetup. Quick plug on what we're up to. So my name is Scott. Rachel is my wife and also co-founder of Aftercamp. We have been in the web development industry now for about 10, 15 years. And I can't officially earmark that because at one point, like I was a dev. I'm like, was I really web? This is a flash question. So I've been in the dev community for over 15 years, but web dev for about 10 plus years, we'll say. Currently, I am the director of engineering for a company called Artisan out in Kansas City. Although Aftercamp itself is we're trying to be more just an online meetup. The whole goal of Aftercamp is really just help people post-graduation from boot camps, post-graduation from CS programs, I don't even want to call it graduation because self-directed learning, and basically people trying to really figure out how to like just what's next, like right, like how do they get the first job, what's the first couple of years look like. One of the things that we've noticed for a long time is that after you get your first job, I think that like largely the experience is different for a lot of devs. It really depends on like your first couple of years. Really depends on those first senior developers you have, the company that you're working for, and so we're really working hard to try to normalize that. Right now, it's just a meetup. We are working on a bunch of other cool stuff. So platform, we got a couple of ebooks that we're writing, a couple of courses we're making, that sort of thing. But you are at the meetup, so thank you for coming. We're going to try to always do meetups monthly. In fact, we are looking at the next 30 days, including some extra sessions specific to helping do like portfolio reviews. So if you get hooked up with us on the Slack channel, we'll give you guys some clues as to when those will drop. Basically, we'll look for about like 3 or 4 people to just check out online portfolios and kind of just give feedback. I've done that with a few people who are actually sitting in this room. I use those guys as a pilot to try to just get a feel for it. But the goal would be to go through resumes, GitHub portfolios, go through code, and just kind of show you what I see from the perspective of somebody who hires a lot of devs. So more on that in a bit, but yeah, if you get hooked up in the Slack channel or through one of like the email channels, we'll send you emails. We'll let you guys know those are coming on. But we're super stoked. Our goal is really just to help people get to where they want to be, and then those first couple of years, kind of giving some clues as to things to think about. So tonight's session is on Python, and everyone, it's funny, like everyone's like, Python, really? I have a plan. I have a master plan of how I want these next few sessions to go. And really one of the biggest things that I've noticed people new in the field is that there's this thing that happens where you go to a boot camp and you are working in full stack system, right? So if you've ever looked at the chart through Prime or through other schools, it's usually like there's a front end, there's a client side, there's a server side, and there's a database, and it communicates through that chain. And you learn about the relationship between those 4 things. And really what I want to work toward is this idea that really there's actually a lot more than that. There's a ton more than that. And so Python is kind of the introductory point to really starting to explain kind of those ecosystems. And so if you look at the next 3 meetups, this one's about Python. I'm going to use it as a way to introduce things like data ingestion and ETLs and all that kind of stuff. We're going to explain what those things mean. And then we get into like things like system architecture a month from now, and then after that we're going to talk about AWS. And I think that AWS is like a perfect way to really start doing system thinking. And what I'm noticing in all these conversations that Rachel and I have with hiring partners is that really a lot of devs are really well positioned to take jobs, and they actually know quite a bit, but they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what they know in some cases, meaning that you are actually capable of a lot more than sometimes you can articulate. So I want to start to kind of extract the valuable things through this meetup, of course, and through these next series of meetups, and say, this is valuable. This is something you should really be making sure that you're like thinking about. So Python, I guess we're going to kind of segue right into it and talk about why Python, why is that the language I picked of all things. And so I really want to get into that, and then get into just, I don't want to spend a ton of time on syntax. I think you can go learn syntax. I have tons of resources and tons of code examples I could share with you all to like, just for you all to go poke through. But I want to talk about some like the more of like the nuanced stuff, the stuff that you would be, that's buried in tutorials that has a ton of value. And then we're going to use that to kind of explain really what's next and what could the next 30 days with Python look, and what would that give you if you were to like decide to focus on that. So first things first, JavaScript is the #1 programming language in the world, largely because browsers heavily, they can execute that, right? But Python, and this is insane, Python took out Java for #2 recently. And you have to really like take a step back and really appreciate how difficult that was, because Java has been long established as kind of like the web server. And you, depending on what geography you live in, you can get in this like kind of this like war between like, is it C# or is it Java, which is popular? It's Java. But Kansas City, for example, is like a 51% C# market, 49% Java market, and it varies market by market. So how did Python take out Java? And the simple answer is that there's a resurgence in interest in Python because of what it is now doing in the machine learning, AI, and data science space. Because that is being fed, it's also feeding the ecosystems that have to do with the web. So to be clear, like machine learning and web are kind of these two different ecosystems. Data science and the web are two different ecosystems, although you can cross over, which is why we're seeing kind of this starting to pick up a bit. So when you think of like web frameworks, when we say JavaScript as like a server, we think like Node. When we think of Java as a server, we think of Spring. When we think of C# as a server, we think of .NET. So what do we think of when we think of Python server? Well, the answer is Django. That's like the big, gnarly like web server. And honestly, JavaScript doesn't really have an equivalent to Django, .NET, or Spring. And so typically when people graduate from boot camps, they typically, not everybody, graduate with some experience in Express. Express is actually what's considered a micro framework. So it's similar. It's based off this a different framework on Ruby called Sinatra. And so the concept of a, one second here. Hold on one second. I decided to tell my kid to stop digging in the gummy bears. He's like making a lot of noise, crinkling in the background. I'm like, dude, you told me. All right. So yeah, it's a micro server, and they basically became popular with Ruby with the Sinatra framework. And so it's good, but JavaScript doesn't quite have that same kind of like big, gnarly, full-scale web framework quite yet. There are some different tools that are starting to spike up. So like there's a JavaScript web server framework called Nest that's like picking up in popularity. Yep, Nest is great. Alex almost beat me to the punch. I think I got it just as you were getting it out, so I saw that too. Nest is great. And then, so now what I'm trying to get at. It's coming for JavaScript. It's not there quite yet. And so part of the reason I want to talk about tonight's session was introduce you to Python, talk about why we're going to get to like the why it's important to know now versus like something else. And then I kind of want to give you like the gateway technology to get into Python, because I think one of the biggest complaints I have about learning a new language is they keep you in the command line far too long and you don't do anything practical. So the goal of why I want to show you Flask tonight is not because I believe that Flask is the next major thing. It's a way to actually use Python and apply it rather than just like type in the command line. So when I show you some Flask tonight, it's not about like, I'm not saying like Flask is the end all be all solution for web servers. That's not what I'm saying. Instead, it's contextual scaffolding and learning, just seeing a little bit of something so that you can use it as a tool to continue to learn Python. But why Python? There's one simple answer, and that is data streaming. It is incredible for data streaming. It is unmatched in terms of its ability to read and process data, which means that it has an incredible advantage over other technologies or other languages when it comes to things like data science, cybersecurity, machine learning, AI, and so on. So you kind of end up in this question of like, do I need to know that? Like, is that important? And I guess what I'm ultimately getting at is maybe. Because I do this thing where I look at kind of like technologies over the course of like 5-10 years, and I've been doing this long enough now where I get to say I do that. And what we're seeing is kind of like these crests of things that are happening over the course of 3 to 4 year periods. And I have two theories about what's going to happen in the next 4 to 5 years. The first is that I actually think, this is crazy talk. Hold on a second. Bear with me. This is crazy, like conspiracy theory, Scott. I think we're going to get to the point where HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are not the #1 web technology. And you're like, what the hell are you talking about? And here's why. There is a big thing that's coming, and I don't think people realize it's happening. And that is that AR, MR, and XR, so virtual reality, extended reality, and mixed reality, is poised to be big. Google's working on it. Apple's working on it. A bunch of big companies are working on taking your phone and putting it into your sunglasses, which is crazy. So McKinley just shot this crazy look of like, that looks freaky, but basically your whole entire phone would be resting on your head. And I think what that's going to mean is it will effectively kill off the browser as we know it. I think it is definitely a possibility, because once we take away the dependency we have on browsers and we change what a browser actually is, it changes the game completely. And actually Python's pretty well positioned to be the technology of choice for that as it relates to streaming data, which your phone will be, your glass phone or whatever the hell you want to call it, will be streaming data like crazy. You got to feed Facebook as you like look around the world. Okay, that's crazy, Scott. Back up for just a second. If that doesn't happen, iPhone, Avi, yeah, for sure. I see what you did there. If that doesn't happen, at the very least, you have a different technology or a different language that you're familiar with. And I will tell you, and I go back and forth on this, and I seem like I have a wishy-washy message, and I don't, because I just want to clear this up. I hire devs. I'm not hiring junior devs right now. I always get asked that question. I will be very vocal on LinkedIn when I'm hiring associate. I hate the word junior, by the way. When I'm hiring associate level devs, I will let everybody know. But the thing that I always look for when we do hire associate level devs is, what have you done? My dogs are now trying to break out of the, like, my family, man, is just like, I'm like, hey, we got this important thing tonight, and my like dogs are breaking out, my kids eating stuff, I guess. So if you hear barking in the background, I apologize. So like, what have you built? What have you done? Is a really important question. And so like, I don't necessarily like need to like, you don't need to have this big crazy depth. The thing is that I look for, and a lot of other hiring partners look for, is, do you care enough to try things and try out code? And Python is once again one of those wonderful like technologies to play with. Okay, enough about that. Let's move on to kind of just the other pluses here. So data streaming is the biggest reason I think that Python is going to be really, really important in the next 10 years, because there's going to be a lot of data flowing through architectures as we go through. It's popular. Took out Java for the #2 language. That's really important. And I think the reason why, of course, is data science, cybersecurity, AI, machine learning, and so on. And it's still super supported. Actually, Python 3.9 came out at the end of last year, and they're working on 3.10 already. So like it is being supported. In fact, you can support it on GitHub through a sponsorship. You can do that. I recommend doing that. And frankly, it's really easy. It's a really easy language to use. And if you're coming from JavaScript, there's a lot of things that are similar, but I would argue that the syntax is super simple, and like it's easy to pick up. Now, really quick, you probably have heard that JavaScript is a weakly or loosely typed language. Have you guys heard that? Right. And part of what we know is when we simple example would be, we create a variable, we say const, because you always start with const and not let. Const new variable equals 10. And when you do that, you don't have to declare the type, it's inferred. And that is kind of what we refer to as like this like loosely typed or weakly typed. And then there's this other side of things. So you've heard like the loosely or weakly versus strongly, but there's also this whole other paradigm of static versus dynamic. And so what's cool about Python is that it shares its dynamicness with JavaScript, but it's slightly tighter. And it's actually, you don't notice it because of how Python is set up. Point being is that Python is very, very similar in like feel to JavaScript, which makes it easy to get into. So there's that. I want to get into just some code examples and kind of walk you through a couple ideas. The first thing I want to do is I'm really big on like environment and kind of talking about the setup. So the first and foremost, the thing that I'm going to recommend, I'm going to actually do a screen share here, is I recommend not using Visual Studio Code, which I know is kind of blasphemy. And I'm about to not see you guys, so Rachel will flag me down if you guys have questions. Let me share my screen. Okay. Not to use Visual Studio Code, but instead, let me get my tools out of the way. Oh my gosh. But instead, to use Pycharm. And Pycharm is a product through JetBrains, and JetBrains makes things like WebStorm. They make IntelliJ IDEA, which is good for Java. They have a PHP Storm, if you're familiar with that one. They have a couple different products, but Pycharm is their Python solution, and I love it. So this is Pycharm. It's kind of gross as an IDE in terms of look and feel, at least I think so. So immediately one of the things I had to correct was the color code. If you know me, I'm pretty big on my colors. I actually don't have anything up there, but you can adjust things like colors. This actually is pretty configurable. And just like Visual Studio Code, it does have a built-in IDE, but there is a massive reason why I recommend Pycharm for your Python IDE. And it takes just a little bit to explain why it's significant, and so I have to kind of scaffold this and set this up a bit. When we use JavaScript and we use Node, we need to install packages. So we say npm I, and then we install like Express, whatever solutions you want, whatever packages you want to install. And what happens when we do that is, of course, Node will use npm to go download from the npm registry. It'll download those modules into a Node modules folder, and then it will save it then to a package.json file. And so basically, Node is grabbing what it needs to run the application. You kind of have that with Python. It is module based. Once again, it's a huge strength in programming languages to kind of break out functionality into separate modules. And when you do that, like, you have to go to your registry and pull down those files. And so instead of npm, we have something called pip, or a pip. So pip will basically install those dependencies into your machine for you. But the difference is that when Node does it, it installs those local to the project that you're working on. When pip does it, it does it right into basically what's called a virtualized environment, or a virtual environment, or a venv, V-E-N-V. So what happens if you don't use venv is that it will install it globally on your machine. So if you take a step back and think about that for just a second, you're like, okay, what does that mean? If you don't use a virtual environment and it installs to your machine, every project you work on has access to every module you've ever downloaded. And just like Node, they'll download also dependent modules. So one module might download 5 other modules. So all of a sudden, every project you do in Python has every single module you've ever downloaded, which gets to be pretty big pretty fast. So to counteract that problem, they use venv, or a virtualized environment. And so it only downloads the files, only downloads the packages into this virtual, you can kind of think of it like as a virtual OS. It's not exactly like that. What's a virtual runtime environment for Python. Now, if you don't use Pycharm, you have to set that venv up. It's not a big deal, but it's like, I'm a programmer, so I'm all about like micro efficiencies. And so I want to save my 5 minutes. I want to save my 2 minutes, really. And so what's nice about Pycharm is that every time you start a new project, it actually sets up the venv for you. So in Pycharm, if you go like new projects, and we're just like Aftercamp Meetup, you can see a new environment using venv. And there's pipenv, there's conda, there's a couple different options, but venv, virtual env is like the one you want to use. So you hit create, and I'm just gonna put this in a new window. And it's creating the virtual environment for us. And this is something that I don't have to do. Once again, how this all relates and kind of how it relates back to JavaScript is it's the equivalent of doing node modules and doing packages in the package.json. It kind of takes care of everything for us. And my computer is probably just screaming at me because I'm trying to record, stream video, and a bunch of other stuff. So apologies, this is deciding not to work. Womp womp. All right, well, nope, now it's working. Oop, I just had to move my mouse. It's testing me. Usually this goes faster. Okay. So when it creates all this, it basically sets up the event for us, sets up a main.py, and we're good to go. Okay. So the biggest reason I say that Pycharm is the best is because if you don't use Pycharm, you have to manage this yourself. It's not a big deal. Almost every intro to Python tutorial shows this. But it's something you got to think about because you don't want to be loading up your machine with a ton of modules. Okay, that was like a huge sidetrack. We haven't even gotten to syntax, and we're basically talking about virtualized environments and like IDEs and whatnot. But yeah, so we're set up and we're good to go. This is the one that I recommend using. Let's go ahead and just take a peek at some syntax. Like I said, I don't want to write a ton of syntax, but I want to show you some syntax. And so I'm going to do a new window. And I have this big old repository that has that I prepped, and it has like a bunch of examples of syntax for like strings and variables and whatnot. I kind of want to just burn through some of this quickly. And I will share this all with you so you guys can kind of see this. And this, like I said, is in most tutorials for Python. But like I said, the goal is not to grind out a bunch of syntax tonight. It's more basically get to the point where we can build a simple server using the syntax. So I don't want to linger here. But what this repo has is it basically has and shows you kind of like how we go about creating variables and how we go about using some of the different syntax. So for example, right here, I have first name equals Scott. So out of the gate, once again, comparing this to JavaScript, we don't have things like var and lets. Scope is kind of a weird thing within Python. We'll get, if we have time, we'll get to that. But we don't need to do things like let const. There's actually not a native way to do constants in Python. And then we also don't have things like a semicolon. You're going to notice that Python itself too it's got a really interesting syntactical flavor to it, in that we don't have things like semicolons to denote like end of statements, and it actually makes heavy use of indentation as well too. So we'll look at that when we get to like if statements and for loops. But simple variable creation, first name equals Scott, prints hello, and then favorite color red. And here you can see we're doing a print statements, and just like JavaScript, we can do things like comma on the strings to kind of combine this to say my favorite color is red. Let's see what else. Input, because once again, I'm gonna go back to something I said earlier. Browsers use JavaScript, but they do not use Python. So like when you write Python, it's typically in like anywhere that you'd use like a command line. So here, this is like a simple application that works a little bit like Mad Libs is the word I'm looking for. And so here it's basically collecting three inputs for you. It's asking you the question, give me a verb. You give it a verb, it stores it in the variable verb. It says, great, now give me a noun, stores it in noun, adjective, and then it makes a print statement that basically plugs in each of those variables into those statements. So here we're actually collecting input. And it'll pause the execution of the application, grab the input, and then store it in the variable. Let's take a look at functions. We don't use the keyword function here. Instead, we use the keyword def, so def. You'll also notice that we are not using code blocks, so we're not using open and close curly braces. Instead, what we do to define scope of a function, we will use a colon, and then to define the scope of the function, we use indentation. So here we're using a tab, which equals above before spaces, but it uses indentation to denote scope. Which is a little kind of weird to get used to if you're coming from JavaScript. But once we exit the indentation, we exit the scope of the function. So here I'm calling the function, passing in the text, converting it to uppercase, and then printing it. Here's a simple split check function. We pulled in the math module. So once again, Python is like very like, keeps its code pretty heavily segregated, so like you will import modules that you need. There is stuff in base Python, but you're going to still import things like math and so on. JavaScript doesn't, at least the JavaScript community hasn't until recently with async await started to make heavy use of try-catch statements, but try-catch is definitely one of those things that if you don't know it in your core language, I highly recommend you get super like comfy with it because it is a great tool. In fact, there is something a little I don't want to call it Easter egg, but something I accounted for on the Aftercamp website. If you go to Aftercamp's website and you sign up your email, you can sign up. You can hit like sign up, and it'll like say, "Hey, great, I got it." And you try to sign up again. It'll check the database and say, "Hey, you're already in here. No worries." But if you send more than 5 requests, it like actually yells at you. It's like, "Yo, bro, you can't hack me." And what I did there is I used a try catch and basically a rate limiter to say, hey, if they try to log in or try to like hit the API more than 5 times in a finite amount of time, go ahead and catch that error. Instead, send an error back down to the front end, do a try catch there, and serve up like a really pretty message that says, yo, bro, don't hack me. But try catches are super helpful, and they became really popular in JavaScript when I think it was ES6 dropped and made use of async await. Could have been ES8, I don't remember off the top of my head. But try catches allow things for you to like wait for responses from the server. You can kind of like nest them together. Anyways, try catches are super important in Python though, because you will get things like value errors. So here what we're trying to do is in this example, we are trying to collect an input from the user. It says, what is the total? And then we're trying to recast or basically convert their input from a string, because the user is going to enter a string, and convert it over to a float. And if it tries to convert something that is not eligible to be a float, it'll serve up a value error, which would actually crash the application. And instead of crashing the application, we can send out a nice little print statement. So try catches are super good, but once again, we see this kind of this pattern of scope and indentation in the try catch. So here we have try this thing. If for some reason we get a system error, we get a execution error, go ahead and catch that error. And instead of crashing the system, let's go ahead and deal with that. So oh no's, invalid input, try again, that sort of thing. Let's see, let's take a peek at loops. So the usual suspects are here. There's while loops. You can see that just from like the syntax of this is that it's very, what I like about it is it's very like conversational. While please is not a request, meaning that here we're collecting an input. If it doesn't contain the string please, it's saying like, hey, you're missing the magic word. What would you like? So then, you know, if you say please in the input statement, it will allow you to pass. So loops, let's see, let's take a look at, there's not the concept of objects in Python. Instead, we call them dictionaries is the closest thing. So here, this is actually referred to as a dictionary rather than an object. That's a little just like vernacular, but just something to be aware of. That it basically has different what they call data structures. So there's a number of different data structures that are different than JavaScript. So JavaScript, for example, has like a basic one, like has like one type of array. And if you've ever looked at other languages, you'll know that there's actually like tons of different kinds of arrays. JavaScript doesn't have a notion of a tuple, whereas like other languages do, and Python absolutely does as well too. And tuple's kind of like a special, I don't know, it's a different kind of data structure that I am trying to like think of a good way to explain it. It's more like a fixed array. I think it might be an okay way to explain that, but you can go check all that stuff out. It's not super important for tonight. There are things like classes. So here is an example of a race car class. Here is essentially our constructor. Classes in Python have references to self. This would be kind of similar to like the reference of this in JavaScript. And so we're setting things like creating self lapse equals 0, color equals color, field remaining, and so on. But here we're taking in the arguments. Here the star cargs is taking in any additional arguments. It's kind of like a catch-all. I used to drive a Ford Tempo. That's why it says Tempo, because whites. This was way back in the day. I don't know if anyone knows the Tempo anymore, but hang on one second. I'm trying to find my chat. Is it a question? Because I can't see it. What are the questions? I can't see them. Rachel's a savior. Yeah, no, so Huck brought up a really good point. So Python doesn't have a notion of an object, but everything are kind of objects. And so then we get into like this conversation, like what's an object, which is like actually a really kind of like deep, like crazy conversation in Python. When I say Python doesn't have the notion of objects, what I'm actually saying is Python doesn't have the notion of calling what they call a dictionary is what JavaScript calls an object. So objects are something a little bit different in Python. The other question was, questions about properties. Properties and methods are universal, I think, and if a language tried to call it something other than a property or method, I think the development world would shake their fist at them. So properties, of course, are things like color or lapse. Those are still properties, where methods are functions that belong to a specific class. So those names still hold true. Cool. Okay, this is some syntax stuff. I'll share this out with everybody so you can kind of just poke through. I think most of it, if you're coming from another language, should be relatively self-explanatory, but I would encourage you to like play with this. And by the way, if you want to run one of these files, all you need to do is go to the terminal, and from the directory, you would want to type in Python 3, and then the name of the file. So there's code completion. Actually, let's just do 1 underscore. And you can just run the files and play with them. So I will give that, and those are just, I'll give to you, and you can play with those if you want. But I want to take a look at an actual Flask server and kind of introduce Flask. Let's go to Flask. Okay. So what we have here is like a super simple server, like web server created in Flask. So a couple notes about this. I'm going to kind of walk through this code a little bit slower than I've talked about some of your stuff. So I'm actually going to break this stuff down. So let's zoom in here a little bit. So first and foremost, you're going to see this import statement. We have this line 1. We're in the app.py file, so we're kind of at that main file, very similar to be like app.js if you're like creating an Express server. So sorry, back up. We're creating something that's. Oop, getting feedback. 1 second. All right, we're creating something that's synonymous with like Express's app.js, and so actually, let's go through and set a simple one up. That might be a really good way. So let's go ahead and create a very simple Express server. So let's say add folder workspace. And book. Oops. Documents and code, personal projects, and we're going to say simple Express. I'm going to add that file. And if we were creating a very simple Express server, we'd probably start off with something like npm init. I'm just going to hit enter through that. And then we do npm I express. So to do this in this first command, if we were to do that in Python with Flask, it would actually be pip install Flask, or pip I Flask. Come back to that though. We'd go ahead and create a new file. So we'd say new file, and we call this like app.js, not KS. Oh my gosh. It's funny when you're teaching, you kind of forget how to do like all the basic things that you do at your desk every day, no problem. All right, so first thing we do is we'd say const express, and I'll just increase the size on that a little bit. Too much. Express equals require express. And we would then say const app equals require, express, and we'd run that. And then we would do app.listen, we define the port, have the callback function, and say console log running on port 5000. That would be like almost just like the most simple server could build. All it does is turn on. So kind of starting off here, this first line is we're kind of doing these two things, right? In JavaScript, we are not only defining a variable, but we're also requiring in a module that we've installed. So we're bringing in Express. So the same thing is happening up here in Flask, where we're actually having kind of these multiple import statements. So we're saying, hey, from Flask, from the Flask module that we used pip to install, bring in Flask, and then we bring in some additional pieces of functionality like render template, JSONify, and request. So here we're actually importing multiple things we can use from one module. Then we're defining the app itself. So here we're creating a variable, and we're setting it equal to the execution of the Flask object. I'm going to go ahead and use that word because that's fine for tonight. And we pass in what they call dunder name. Now, quick thing about what this variable is, or at least this a little bit of the setup, is that Python has a kind of this series of like usable objects that we can that are made available through Python. And typically, when it's made available through Python, it has the double underscore prefix and postfix. And the Python community, I don't really like this name, but it's there anyways. They call it dunder. So like this is dunder name. So here we're passing in this thing that Python makes available to us called dunder name, and it really just has to do with the file name. So here we're saying, hey, create a new app, Flask, pass in dunder name, and it basically creates the app for us. Now, something that's important to note is we're not actually defining something. We're not defining the port. Flask, by default, actually binds to port 5000. So we don't actually need to define that port because it's automatically setting that up for us. Okay, so the next thing that's happening in this file is that we are creating a very simple array. So here we're creating list of cats. And one of the things I want to note here that's really important is there is a code convention for variable names in Python. It's called snake case, hence Python. And snake case is all lowercase words separated by underscores. So here we're using snake case to create a variable called list of cats. And we're setting it equal to Gizmo, which is my old cat. He was the best cat in the world. Ask me about him sometime. And then I had a student once who had a cat named Grilled Cheese, and I don't know why, but that really stuck with me. So his cat was named Grilled Cheese, and I dug it. So we have two cats. We have Gizmo, and we have Grilled Cheese. And then after that, we're basically setting up our route definitions. So here, very similar to the way that Java Spring does it, which if you've checked out Java Spring, is that we have the annotation syntax basically saying, hey, we're defining an app route, and this is defining itself to the base route. And then here we're then creating a function that follows up. The function name actually really doesn't matter. It's more for Python Flask to know like what's up. But like saying like this is the function that will run when somebody tries to connect to this base route. And then it's returning the result of the render template, which I'll get to in a second, and it's sending back this index.html file. So kind of like what's synonymous in JavaScript would be something that looks a little bit like this. We have like app.use, express.static, and you might do something like server public, and you might have like a public directory, something like that. Now what's cool about that is that automatically configures the base route for you. There's actually a lot of magic in this little line of code in JavaScript that you don't have to worry about things, but it sets a lot of stuff up for you, mostly just serving base index files and things like CSS files and JavaScript files and so on. Over here in Python, something very different is happening. If you're coming primarily from the JavaScript world, so I know there's a lot of prime students on here, and someone wants to say something that is like might be crazy to other students from other or graduates from other programs, but primers might have not seen this. So I want to just take a quick moment to explain this. Is that in JavaScript, they've really gotten away from the use of something called a template. And if you've ever looked at something like handlebars.js or Pug, Pug and handlebars are a template render engine for JavaScript Node. And what that means is that the server is prepping the HTML and basically pre-populating data into the HTML file. It's kind of what we did before we had some really fancy client-side frameworks like React and Angular and so on. To some extent, jQuery even filled this need as well too. So most of the business logic used to be done on a server. A lot of business logic is being offloaded at the front end, and now there's a resurgence for it to come back to the server. Welcome to web development. It's confusing as hell at times, and you're hopping into the middle of it. So hang with me for a minute. So what this does is basically it renders out a template file and it's pointing to a specific directory because of the way that Flask is set up. So what render template actually does is it goes and reaches into the templates file and looks for something called, in this case, index.html. So it's going and serving up this file. Oops, I accidentally did some moving. There we go. And serving back this file. We're running a little short on time, so I'm going to make some other files available, but actually, let's see. Do I have it up already? I don't. I'll come back to it if I have time. Python and Flask actually makes use of a render engine called Jinja 2. And basically, there's a way to do things like inheritance in HTML files and all sorts of other crazy stuff. Don't need to get into it tonight, but definitely will come up if you're researching Flask. So the next thing I have here is a second route that acts as a get and a post. But I'm going to pause for a question that I'm going to read 1 second. Test asked a really good question that I'm going to probably defer to the end. It asked about Django and what the difference is between Django and Flask. I will definitely, that's a great question, and I kind of want to wrap up with that. So I promise I'll come back to you. So here is one way to set this up. So here we're defining the route as API kittens, and we have 2 different methods, and we have the get method and the post method. Now in Express, you might actually define these as different, right? You might do something where you say app.get, and you have your setup, and then you have app.post, and then you have your setup, and you define your routes as API kittens, and you do API kittens. And so here we have we have 2 different functions, or 2 different implementations that call callback functions based off what HTTP verb you're using or accessing, and then so get or post, and then the different route. But in Flask, what you do is actually have the same route, and then you actually say, here are the methods that qualify. So get, post, put, delete, whatever you decide to put in. And then you tap into the request object that we imported up here, and we say, is the method post? And if it's not post, in this case, it's going to be get. So here we're returning the list of cats. And then over here in the post, we are appending versus pushing. We are appending to the list of cats the request data of name. So let's actually fire this up here real quick just to show you this working. So we're going to say Flask run. And so this is running on port 5000, and we're just going to use, we'll use Postman, and we're going to say get kittens, and we'll hit send. And it sends us back the list of kittens. So we got Gizmo and we have grilled cheese. So if I wanted to add to that list, I could just do a post. API kittens. We will go into the body raw. We'll do JSON. And then we're going to send up an object that has a name. And then we'll put in my dog's name, Baxter. And we'll hit send. And it got on the post there, it actually sent back the list of kittens in this case. So we added Baxter to the list of kittens. He's kind of like a cat. Anyways, that's not confusing at all. So here we're actually able to do gets and posts based off that little bit of Flask code that we run. So my point is, I guess, is that Flask is like nice because it's got a super like simple, straightforward syntax and approach to simple REST APIs, very similar to the way Express is handling it. So it feels very familiar out of the gate. I noticed that we're getting to the top of the hour here pretty quick, and so I want to leave time for questions and stuff. So I kind of want to just leave with a couple thoughts before we like wrap things up. The first is that I want to be really clear. I think that Python is a good language to learn. It is not the only language, and it's not going to be like the silver bullet. It enables you to get into other areas syntactically. So if you are thinking about your career kind of 5 years out and saying, well, gosh, maybe I want to get into cybersecurity, or gosh, maybe I want to get into machine learning or AI or any of these other things, it's a good thing to dip your toe into right now. It's a good secondary language to have in your pocket. The other reason it is a big deal is that data is becoming a really big deal. Big data, data science is becoming more and more popular. In fact, they're starting to diversify the data science roles. And so you have things like data scientists and data engineers now. and data engineers are even kind of becoming mixed into like regular development workflows. And so there's this concept of something called like an ETL, for example, which is a very special kind of server. And you are probably very familiar with the concept of a server, right? Front end talks to the server, but there are actually just servers that talk to servers, and we call these services typically. And so in the next Aftercamp Meetup, we're going to talk a lot about system architecture. We're going to get into things. We're talking about like monolith versus n-tier versus services versus like all this stuff that you might not have visibility to, but we're going to really heavily tether it back to what you know. So we're going to ground kind of like this very complex system conversation into the things that you might have learned at bootcamp or as a CS grad. So, but the important thing is that Python plays kind of this integral part in a lot of different types of services because more and more services are becoming very data dependent. So to me, I guess from my perspective is I don't necessarily see Python as like the thing that you would use to build a RESTful server, but I do see it as a really amazing tool. When developers have it, I love it. And so it's not like I'm saying go all in on Python. I'm just saying like Python is something that it would be really beneficial to your career if you were to touch it from time to time, spend a week with it, hop off of it for a couple of weeks, hop back into a week for it, and so on. Now, somebody asked a really good question about Django. So I want to underline something I'd said before, and that is that Flask is what we refer to as a microserver, very similar to Express. It's a great, Flask to me is a really great way to practice Python syntax in like an environment that matters, right? Because you can like build a front end for this. You can actually, let's actually show you one more example here real quick. Maybe I do this while I'm talking. Maybe not. Maybe I'll let it go. Maybe I'll record a quick video and send it later. But I actually have a small demo set up where I actually have a node server talking to a Flask server, and they're talking back and forth. So maybe I'll record a quick video to share with you all later, if all that works. But really this idea of being able to spin up simple little servers and services quickly is what Flask and Express are all about. But somebody asked about Django, and I actually mentioned Django before, and I also talked a little bit about .NET and Spring. These Django, Spring, .NET are like full web frameworks. And if you're coming from the JavaScript world, this concept is kind of foreign to you. But basically what's nice about these web frameworks is there's a lot of tools out of the box that are built in for you. There's this really cool little demo I do at Prime, or I used to do at Prime, where I would set up, in like under 15 minutes, I would set up a full REST API hooked up to Mongo, and I never had to write an endpoint because Spring just does it for you based off the data model that you set up, and you setting up a repository. It actually sends up like your get, post, put, delete for you. And that's where Django kind of comes in. And like I said, JavaScript is now just kind of getting that with a technology called Nest.js, but Nest.js is still not widely adopted. So if you want to get like really go deep into like Python, you're like, man, I love the language, I love what it's doing, and I want to make a job out of it, Django's the way to go. Because if you're going to get a job writing servers or writing, setting up full stack web development with Python, Django's like the gateway for that. That said, I am seeing a lot more Flask postings lately. They are creeping up there. I've actually, like in the past 2 months even, I've had like a couple of people reach out to me like, do you know any Flask developers? I'm like, really? And then like literally I have 2 projects out of our portfolio of 20 where I work right now. 2 of them are Flask projects, and they're data ingestion projects. So it's like, it's the server framework I'm talking about for exactly the reason why I use Python. So Django does more out of the box. I would encourage you to check that out, what that means, but I would actually spend just a little bit of time with Flask before you hop into Django, just so you can appreciate the differences if you're coming from the JavaScript world. I will have a ton of resources that I sent out. I'll send out some repositories of code to look at, some tutorials I recommend checking out if you want to check out Python this month. But when we come back next month, what we're going to talk a lot about is just like really more like a conceptual level. So here, Lucid Chart's going to be our best friend next session. And so this was like the example I was going to show you, where here I have like a Postman front end talking to a Node backend that talks to a Flask that talks to Node and sends the information back to Postman. And so when we start thinking about system structures, and not just the app, but like beyond the app, what's going on, and things like shared databases and single sign-on, which is SSO, monolith versus microservices, and like how does all that stuff. And we're basically going to really spend time breaking that down next time. But spending a little bit of time with Python might help out with that quite a bit. Okay, I'm going to shut up. We got a couple minutes for questions, but if you want to hop off, you're welcome to hop off too. It's been pretty awesome chatting with you all. So I am a resource to you for the next, well, as long as you want to keep me. What you got? I can now see the chat. Not out of the box. There are patterns that are established. There's a lot of as you get deeper into Flask, and especially as Flask increases in popularity, I'm seeing more and more stuff that pops up that enforces some of the same concepts that you'd see in Django. But for the most part, you can kind of, it uses templates, but it doesn't enforce things like model controller. Like you can, typically when I set up Flask projects, I'll separate my models from my controllers. Other questions?
So I have not necessarily like a question, but just an overall thing that I was struggling with. So I when I graduated Prime, this is mostly for Prime folks. I did like an app with Python and Vue and TypeScript and a bunch of different technologies that we didn't learn. And I found, at least in working with Flask, that with trying to have Flask and Python talk with Postgres, I came into a major issue because I had an M1 Mac and the library of PsychoPG2 was just not working. So mostly just like a warning out there that I ended up using like another Python to Postgres library that worked called PG8000. But there was a big headache there in trying to get those two things to talk to each other. And then I was looking at Django too, and they use the exact same library. So yeah. Just was throwing that out there.
I gotta tell you, so Kevin, you underscored something beautiful that I think really needs to be called out, and that is, I think that there is a ton of value in hiring conversations about those kinds of problems that you're like, gosh, I had a really hard time getting this thing to work, and it turns out it was this M1 problem, and I worked through it, right? And this is how I did it. I think one of the biggest things that job seekers are afraid to talk about is what struggles they have, and I gotta tell you, as a person who has hired hundreds of developers, I'm not looking for perfection. I'm actually looking for the opposite. I'm looking for what have you solved, and talk me through that. In fact, the interview strategy that I would talk about at Prime, and then that I employ right now, is that I will purposely ask questions until I figure out what the person doesn't know, and that's the only thing I want to talk about is what they don't know. And the reason I do that is because I want to see how they handle difficulty and how they handle challenge and strife, because the industry itself is full of new stuff all the time, meaning there's no way to know it all. It's impossible, right? There's just no way to get everything. And ultimately what we're looking for when we're looking to hire a developer is what have you figured out? And talk me through what that was like. So without even knowing, you just beautifully illustrated one of the best conversation pieces in an interview that you could possibly illustrate. So I can't say that enough. I think associate level developers put the burden of perfection on themselves when they go to apply for a job. The goal is not perfection. The goal is build as much as you can, break as much as you can, and learn how to articulate it.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Cool. And actually, that's a really good kind of serve up too, because I think that the session that we're going to insert between now and the next session is going to be a lot more focused on just conversation around hiring. And so we're going to do a call for, I don't know what we want to call it, but a call for portfolios where we ask for your resume, we ask for your GitHub, we ask for your LinkedIn. And I'll go through and I'll just talk about what I see. And I'll talk about as a hiring manager, here's exactly what I see when I'm looking at that. In fact, I see Huck is on here. Huck and I did that for a bit. And I think it's just kind of like a good way to like just see it through my eyes. And so we'll just do a session where we like talk about it live. And so like obviously if you volunteer, like we get to pull up your stuff, and so like you're gonna get picked apart from a very loving place. I'm not doing it from a nasty place at all, but I think that like people are sometimes surprised about what I pay attention to versus what I don't. And the other thing I want to say, I just like the caveat to all of Aftercamp and everything that we're doing right now, it is just a perspective that I have, and it's a perspective from just talking to a lot of people who hire. There are other perspectives out there that are equally as right, that differ from me, because we're all freaking humans and everyone's got a different take on it. But at the very least, I can talk about it from the way that I see it. So,
yeah. I'll say it was a light but useful roasting.
I appreciate you, Huck. Brad, I'm going to make you do it because I like you. So I think Brad just volunteered.
I will say that I'm very used to being roasted, studying, private like music lessons. But it's like one thing when it's like music, and I feel like it's like a completely other thing when it's my code, because I don't have that, like those 1,000 hours yet. So I feel like I am, I just don't have the like, I don't know, confidence. So it like sounds scary, but maybe.
Yeah. It's funny. Code is like so oddly personal. Like I get like really sweaty when other people look at it. Like I've been doing this a really long time, and I still get really like insecure and like sweaty palms about like oh, you're gonna look at my code? Like, ugh. Like, don't judge me, but like I wrote it quick. You say stuff like that to them, like versus like when I look at people's code, I'm like, don't worry. Like I know you wrote this in 5 minutes. I know it's crap. Let's just go through and talk about. It's not like a personal attack. Yeah, code reviews are definitely the best and worst days. Alex has got a really good point there.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
What's a good project to put on your like a LinkedIn or to link to a GitHub on your resume?
That's a great question. So two things. There's two big schools of thought that I have on this. The first is, and like I definitely did it tonight. I'm like, hey, here's Python. Here's something new you probably haven't looked at. You should play with it. Like I think that's really important. And then the other side, the other school of thought is, but you should definitely have like your base thing, like your like JavaScript, I'm guessing is most people's base thing that they do. And so I like to see both. I like to see some experimentation, but I also like to just see a lot of like you using your core language. And like, look, like a calculator has been done, like, like the to-do list has been done. I almost don't care about the what. I almost care more about that you did it and what did you integrate with it. And so one of the things that is like the easiest way to like show on a portfolio is just pull in a third-party API. Like almost like find a third-party API and be like, what can I build with that third-party API? And so things like, like there's the Google Maps, things like that. Like building like a simple password checker using the ZXC VBN module is a fun one. And if you're like wondering how I came up with that, look at your keyboard. Start with Z. ZXC VBN is a password strength checker that I use on a Google project. It's just fun to implement like a front end for it. Be like your password's too strong, not strong enough, that sort of thing. I think like anything that's got like integrations with third-party APIs are gold, because this goes back to the system idea that we're going to talk about next session. Is that one of the biggest hurdles for associate level developers breaking the industry is understanding how systems talk to each other. So third-party APIs answers that question. It's like you don't know you answered it, but you like your system talked to another system and then it talked back to you, and like that's a really cool thing to show. And so anything built with third-party APIs is typically pretty gold. The other big recommendation I have too is that don't focus on something big, but don't focus on something too small. So you're kind of like, well, what the hell does that mean, Scott? So typically what I recommend is it should take about a week or two per project and then get off of it. And you'd be surprised how much done doesn't actually matter. The other big recommendation I have too is be careful how you talk about it. I know Rachel's really big on this. I'm really big on this. It doesn't matter what you didn't do. It matters what you did. And I think a lot of times what I find in bad interviews when I'm interviewing people is that the interviewee is quick to tell me what they didn't get done which automatically takes away from all the cool crap that they built. So I already am fixated because they told me to be fixated on what they didn't do. And so like, look, like, if you sit down and interview with me, like I'm going to feel a lot of the way you tell me to feel. So like, if you're like, yep, I built this really cool thing in 2 weeks. I picked at it for 2 weeks at night, about 30 minutes a night. And we're like, awesome. Like, that's great. Like I'm excited because like you care enough about code to like pick at something and work at something. And then I think, the other big thing too is just like don't let months go by in between projects and you're like, oh my God, it's been 2 months since I built something. Don't freak out. Just start building now. Just build. Update your resume. Update your GitHub. Change your featured repos. If I ever check out somebody's GitHub, I just honestly, guys, I'm pretty lazy. I look at the featured repos or I look at what are you working on recently. So if you don't have featured repos, I go right to your repo list. I look at the top 3, kind of poke around a little bit, and then I'm good. I'm just to get an idea of what you do, and we'll talk about that in that session about what specifically I'm looking at. But Test, hopefully that answered your question, man. I'm just gonna call you Test because that's your name on there. But does that kind of scratch the itch?
I don't know how that happened. I'm Andrew, by the way. Yeah.
Nice
but yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that. That helped.
Cool. Other questions at all? I like these. I like answering these questions.
Not code related, but this is my first time here. So do you do this stuff like weekly, monthly? What's your schedule?
Yep. Right now we're on a month cadence. And we'll probably, Rachel and I have been talking about this here. We're going to probably keep the core series at a monthly cadence, but we want to interject like on the off 2 week cadence. Like we want to get it to be about every 2 weeks, but on the off cycle, we'll probably talk more about like job hunting and like going through resources and best practices and giving you guys some more insight into getting that first job. And then really like beyond that too, another big focus I have is after you get that first job, what should your first 2 years look like? I think that is a big question mark for a lot of people that unfortunately is largely dependent at the company that you end up at. And I have seen plenty of companies be really bad at that. So I try to give you just some topics to look at. So we'll talk about both those areas on those off sessions. Great question, Nick. Thank you for coming too, by the way.
Thanks.
Dusty, as always, I like your cat.
I think she enjoys your voice, Scott.
Hi, cat. What's the cat's name so I can add it to the list?
Her name is Lilo, and I also have a Stitch.
That is perfect.
And they totally act like the two, except the roles are kind of reversed.
I have a dog that looks like Stitching.
Me too. I've got Boston Terriers. They kind of look.
We got brother sister here.
That's
Everyone's
perfect.
like, what does this have to do with code? It has nothing to do with code. It's just dogs. All right.
Guys, I was waiting for that dog sighting.
I know. Yeah, that was 100% for you, Shoofs.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Well, cool. Hey, if you're not a couple plugs here, real quick. If you're not plugged into the Slack group, get plugged into the Slack group. I think Rachel, can you post that in the chat? Perfect. Rachel already posted in the chat. We are sending out all sorts of free stickers and stuff too. So if you guys get hooked up in Slack, we'll send you free Aftercamp swag. We're working on a lot of really cool stuff. So if you guys are not on our email list, you guys can get hooked up on the emails through the websites. But yeah, we're ramping up. We're working on a lot of cool things, and we're excited just to keep helping. So Charles has a question, so I will stick around for that. But you guys are welcome to leave. Thank you so much for coming, Charles. I'm here for you. What you got?
Thanks, Scott. So about a year ago, I attended a boot camp, and that was a lot of fun to learn. I'm actually a product manager. I've got an engineering background, but not in the SWE world. It's mainly like mechanical systems. So I kind of did it for fun because working in the finance world, everything is kind of based on data. I've been trying to figure out ways in which I can continue to improve my coding skills, but I don't necessarily think I'll be making the jump over. So I'm wondering if there are ways in which, for instance, there are ways to contribute to projects in a small way, right? Like what you're saying, focusing in these 2-week sprints or something of the sort. At least for me, it would be really useful to sort of keep that going and continuing to learn. Because I think going, into the SWE world and doing that professionally is quite challenging. And at my point in my career, I don't think it's the right move to be able to make. So sorry if that's an untrue question.
No, it's like I have a lot of thoughts, and so I'm trying to quickly refine my thoughts as you're structuring that. So, my immediate thought is that there are a couple of really cool websites out there. freecodecamp.org has got like a lot of really cool tutorials, and typically as they teach you, they have you build lots of little things, which is good. The other site is a little more, you have to kind of follow my thinking on this. It's a site called PactPub. They are a tech book publisher site. Every day they give away a free book, but they have a series of books called blueprints. And so it'd be like JavaScript blueprints, ES6 JavaScript blueprints. And what I like about those blueprints books from PactPub is that they're like all these like little projects. And so it's a way to like kind of just like follow along and follow along with the book. And kind of has something cool to show at the end. It's less about like teaching and more about just kind of like let's build something cool together. I think I always get this question about like algorithm sites or like these little challenge sites, and I think they're good. But the biggest thing I think that makes programming interesting is when it applies to the real world or like you have some level of interaction. So. Yep. Like games become kind of like this easy thing to like want to make because like they are kind of like instantly satisfying. And so there are a lot of books out there that focus on like, basic game development using, any language you want, Python, JavaScript, and so on. Unity is a great one for that. But I think like ultimately it's like, what's the thing that's going to keep you wanting to do it? That's like fun and has some novelty to it. And you can definitely send me a message on like LinkedIn and we can kind of chat more. Like I'd love to dig into that a little bit because like I want to ask questions like, you get this as a product owner. I'm like, what do you like to do? What kinds of things motivate you? And so I want to ask a bunch of questions. So let's hook up on LinkedIn and let's get you down a path. I think that'd be a really cool way to do it if you're open to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's my first time attending this, and I was like, oh, there's an Aftercamp. Okay, this sounds perfect.
Yeah, right.
So I'm glad I showed up.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I got just one more, Scott.
Yeah, please.
You did mention you're not hiring right now. When you do hire junior devs, do you hire only in the United States or do you hire like globally?
Currently, we're just in the United States, and it has to do with some sponsorship laws and the state of Missouri and stuff like that we're based out of. But let's definitely stay in touch because I have a pretty huge network, so I can definitely put you in touch with people who do. So let's connect on LinkedIn and shoot me a message, and we'll if you're looking, we'll definitely get you sorted out.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, man. Thanks for coming too. Where are you from?
Canada.
Canada, perfect. Rachel's super networked in like the world, so she's like, oh, I have a ton of connections in Canada, so we'll hook you up, Nick. We got you.
Right over. Thank you.
Actually,
yeah.
We'll send you something too, Nick, because I just came across a job posting that's only like Toronto or Montreal for junior internships.
Awesome. Thank you.
Rachel says, look at the company Furnish.
Furnish, never heard of them. We'll do.
Perfect, thank you. Cool, great. Thanks for coming, guys. I will see you all next time when we talk about system architecture for newish developers. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.